Welcome to this episode of You Should Read This, here again with Tom van der Lubbe. I'm Richard Atherton, and today we are discussing The Dawn of Everything, a new, and Tom's holding up in Dutch for our Dutch viewers, a new history of humanity by David Graeber and David Wengrow. And this, Tom, was your suggestion, and you read this first, so maybe it makes sense for you to give us an introduction to and summary as to what this book is about.
Yeah, thank you, Richard. It was more or less coincidence. I saw this book a couple of months ago, and then during a summer vacation, I saw an enormous amount of people reading the book and posting about it. I actually wanted to read it during my summer holidays, but I didn't because I was spending time with my kids. And to start with the conclusion, this is one of the seldom books which, let's say, changed or has the ability to change narratives. And if I like something about reading is, and it happens not that often, that if you read something and then suddenly you say, okay, the stuff I believed in until now has changed by reading this book. And this is such a book for me. So I'm really happy and glad that we can discuss the book, and also looking very forward to reactions, because I think it's a book which creates or gives us the opportunity to discuss, let's say, basic questions about our society, so to say.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about this narrative, or it's a changed narrative. What do you consider to be the ways in which this book has given you, I guess, new possibilities for different narratives about society or humanity or history?
I think for me there are, let's say, two main topics if you talk about, let's say, changing narratives. And the first is that I studied history, and I thought, okay, I went to university to, let's say, become educated, let's say, develop a critical mind. And I thought, okay, this is a kind of objectivity in how you are educated. And then this is one of those books where you find out it was not, let's say, there is no such thing as objectivity. And even if you think about, let's say, studying history as a kind of chronology, how do you say this? Chronology. Yeah. And then you suddenly have a lot of things which he describes. Where you say, okay, I didn't study this in this way. So to take one example is the whole idea of enlightenment. And we'll, let's say, dive into that probably much more profoundly. Where I thought, okay, that's a Western invention. There are those intellectuals in Paris, they started to discuss those principles. And then at a certain point, we found out about, let's say, liberté, égalité, fraternité. This book has a quite different, let's say, story about the whole history of enlightenment. And the second topic is, and we'll also probably dive into this, is that if, let's say, structures or cities or societies become more complex, you need a kind of vertical hierarchy. I mean, I'm also used to this topic because, let's say, we implement in our company self-organization, and I have some political background, rotation of leadership and this kind of stuff. So I already had some examples that I should, let's say, also see this as a kind of narrative, but that's also something where David Graeber and David Wengrow dive into and come with a lot of interesting examples.
Yeah, and it was that second shifted narrative that you point to about how we only get our civilization or large-scale societies through hierarchy, right? Through formal hierarchy, is something this book blows away, which I love. But coming back to the former point about the Enlightenment, then, so how did this shift things for you in terms of your understanding of the Enlightenment specifically, and what does this book throw up?
What I found extremely interesting, and I really didn't know that, is that let's say when the French or colonized the U.S., there were a lot of conversations with the, let's say, local inhabitants of the U.S. And this whole idea of that we invented in the West, those intellectuals invented this whole Enlightenment is just, let's say, when I just read the books and I see the sources, it's just not correct. So Jesuits and others, they went there and they documented the conversations with those let's say local cultures on a very intellectual level, and it was more or less the other way around. So their societies had those principles of liberty, freedom, equality, egalitarian society, and also one of those principles was only obey the rules if you really believe in this. And he also dives into this. And then, let's say, the French and those Jesuits, they were influenced in a very severe way, a very strong way by those conversations. They wrote them down, and those books were very popular. So they were kind of bestsellers during, let's say, the end of the 18th century in Paris. And what I find so striking is that during this period, those books have been written. There has been a very strong, let's say, discussion in Paris about those books. They were very popular. And then, let's say, 200 years later, I study history in university, and I just don't know this. I just learn Enlightenment as if it was a Western invention. And that's what I find confronting, but also interesting. So the conclusion, on the one hand, is there is not such thing as an objectivity. So at least this whole idea of a kind of discours or kind of discussion, or what I often call, could the opposite also be true, is probably a good exercise, no matter what kind of discussion you have. And it's not about what you believe or what your own opinion is, but at least create more space for a kind of alternative or alternative thinking.
Mm. Yeah, and I thought that what was interesting, in terms of learning about those exchanges with, as you say, often these French intellectuals, and particularly in Canada, right, when the French were colonizing Canada, and how they had to admit that many of these natives of that area were far better orators, debaters than they were, right?
Yeah.
And so they were accepting that that the societies there were producing, in some senses, finer minds than the French educational system was. And they introduced this character who, I grew to love reading the book, Candia Ronk, who was one of the elders there. And this book reproduces some of those exchanges. I wonder if I should quote one of them here, just to give you a flavor.
I think so, yeah.
What we're talking about. So La Hontan. So this is in the context of punishment and the judicial system that's operating. So La Hontan, who's talking with Candia Ronk, this Native American. This is what, so La Hontan says, this is why the wicked need to be punished and the good need to be rewarded. Otherwise, murder, robbery, and defamation would spread everywhere. And, in a word, would become the most miserable people upon the face of the earth. So making the case for the French justice system. And then Candia Ronk, again, the Native American. For my own part, I find it hard to see how you could be much more miserable than you already are. And I was finding myself laughing out loud at these 100-year-old quotes, or multiple 100-year-old quotes from these guys. What kind of human, what species of creature must Europeans be that they have to be forced to do good and only refrain from evil because of fear of punishment? We have observed that we lack judges. What is the reason for that? Well, we never bring lawsuits against one another. And why do we never bring lawsuits? Well, because we made a decision neither to accept or make use of money, right? Here are societies with no money. And why do we refuse to allow money into our communities? The reason is this: we are determined not to have laws because since the world was a world, our ancestors have been able to live contentedly without them. And this must have blown, well, it was blowing the minds of these intellectuals. And I suppose it gave them a whole new conception of what it might mean to be free, which was never really adopted by European societies, right? We kept our kings, we kept our laws, we kept our money, but it had a huge influence.
What I find, I also love this quote, and I thought, okay, one has to read these books. So that's what David Graeber and David Wengrow did. They went into those sources. So they just had a look. Okay, where did Rousseau take the stuff from? And they went deeper and deeper, and that's what you call primary sources when you study history. So and then you read the stuff and you say, you just imagine those French, or it's also 17th century, not only 18th century. They go there, they have this kind of idea of total superiority, and they have perhaps in a way that they have guns or their power, and then you have those leaders, and there are different, let's say, different people talking about Canada, but also on other parts of Northern America. And they have this intellectual superiority, and they're just laughing at those French or these Jesuits. And what is interesting is that those Jesuits, they were interested also in the intellectual discourse, or the intellectual debate. And what you just see if you read this kind of text, that they are influenced in a very strong way, and there is a lot of sympathy for what they learn from these conversations. So it's difficult for them in their cultural setting, as it is for us now, to admit that they are wiser and more civilized, which you also see, for instance, you talk about the whole climate or society or belonging or let's say mental problems, etc. And another example he describes, or the authors describe also a little bit to prove this in an indirect way, if people were between those societies. So for instance, if they stayed for a certain time with those, let's say, local inhabitants, for instance, in their environment, and then they wanted to go back to the Western society, and they could choose, they would even choose to stay in this kind of more primitive societies. Why? Because there was much more solidarity, or much more belonging, or a kind of you can call it even a more human way of connecting to each other, which also proves on a let's say individual scale, that if somebody lives in those two different societies, people feel much more attached to this, what we call more primitive societies, which I found a strong example to, let's say, next to this more intellectual debate about, is our society more humane or more equal, or do we have more freedom? But I just imagining those French people going there, and then somebody says, no, we are more free. We laugh about your society. It's just who are you to tell me that you from the West have a more let's say a better society, or why do you think you're superior?
Yes, that's right, and that was it in both senses. So there, he cited that the authors cite examples of children who would be taken from those native environments and brought up in French families, and whenever they then got the opportunity to return, they would return and stay. And the same goes if you took, as you say, somebody from a Western society, and they spent a significant period of time, they also wanted to stay. And part of it perhaps links to this idea of freedom. You mentioned it, freedom, and they use a definition, the authors of freedom in this book, which they use as a kind of as a yardstick, I think, to judge the level of freedom a particular society is providing, and they define it in along 3 lines. So it's the freedom to move away or relocate from one's surroundings. And so to take that first one, and we'll go through all 3. But what you found that a lot of these individuals in primitive societies could travel widely, right? And they would travel, and they could travel between areas, with no money, but they're living in a network of relationships between tribes and between the different societies that enabled them to prevail on the hospitality of other tribes, and obviously and the skills and their abilities to travel and gather food as they were traveling, and they had that freedom. And you compare that, to take that first example, with today, there are many countries in the world you can't leave. And there are certainly many places you can't go to if you're from certain countries. And so these societies had great levels of freedom in that respect. You mentioned it earlier. The second is the ability to ignore or disobey commands.
Yeah.
You try disobeying the command of a policeman in the West. You're not going to get very far. And then the third is shape new social realities or shift back and forth between different ones. I mean, who right now in any Western society has any real power to shape how they're governed? You got to live with what you got to live with. That's the reality for most people living in the West.
What I also find interesting, and I if you think about Foucault, for instance, punishment, I also see a direct link. So let's say punishment as society, or to lock people up somewhere. And the question is always, who are being locked up somewhere? Which is a very interesting philosophical debate. And the other thing is, if you talk about, let's say, being able to travel or getting food somewhere, if you see just, let's say, the tradition of Christianity and monasteries, etc., or even you just can take the Bible as an example, it's always about helping people who are in need. And that's also something where we are pretty far away now in our current societies. So and that's also something, for instance, which is extremely interesting. If there's, let's say, native leaders are discussing with the Jesuits, which have this kind of Christian morale, and then they say, but if somebody comes by, we always would help them. We always would be able to give food to somebody. People are even able to travel, and they will never have a problem about, let's say, getting enough food, or etc. etc. This whole idea of hospitality goes to a moral level, and that's what I find extremely fascinating. So I don't know if let's say those native leaders have also read the Bible or something like that, but they even would have been able to just to put a mirror up and say, okay, so where's your morale? Where's your morale? Please explain me why you think you are much more superior than our native, let's say, native societies. You may be stronger, but we are, from a moral point of view, superior to your society.
Right. And this was, I mean, you talk about this challenging narrative. So I've always had very strong libertarian leanings politically, and I'd always seen the sort of foundations of any libertarian society would need is about property rights, so the ability for me to own my own property, and that being foundational to living free, right? Is that I can build my own house, and I don't need to worry about the government taking away my property, right? And reading this book and understanding it is a lot of the basis of, I suppose, of libertarian political thought is based on the Roman law, right? A lot of it has its origins there. and this book talks about the foundations of Roman law being in slavery, and a lot of that has its traces back to there. And so this idea that perhaps I'm conceiving freedom through the lens of a political system that's based around slavery and how that might be flawed has been interesting for me. And the flip that perhaps these societies with no conception of property rights and no conception of law per se may offer greater freedoms than anything we could conjure up, in the sort of Western system of thought. That was really challenging. That I could be freer in literally a lawless society. And that's not to say that these societies were always peaceful. I mean, that's the point being made, right? They have wars. They go to war with each other. But the distinction, and this, let's just take the example of the Wendat, who Candia Ronk, who I quoted earlier, was a member of. They would have wars with other tribes, but this is the point that Candia Ronk, they would never go to war against themselves. There's no punishment towards their own people. And that was what he was found so fascinating about Western societies, is that we will murder our own people. We will put our own people in prison.
What I also find very interesting is if you take this idea of freedom, because let's say in the book one dives, let's say also into this dimensions. Then, for instance, I don't know what page it is in it's 148. It's about the Jesuit Lallemant, and then it's about freedom, and then the Wendat. They dive into this idea of freedom, and then it's about freedom as a practicality. So is a freedom still free? A freedom if you can't act in a way that you have this freedom. So and this is also a discussion we have. If you talk about, let's say, voting rights, you can have a right to vote, but if there is a lot of let's say, influencing the political system by spending money or lobbying, etc. And the question is, okay, what kind of rights are these rights in practice? And so you talk, let's say, you take one example of freedom to travel, or freedom to move or to move away, but it also goes much further to what are real freedom rights if you can't act accordingly. And that's something which we, I think, realize in our societies very much. Although we always learn about one man, one vote. One man, one vote is not one man, one vote, or one woman, one vote.
Yeah, that's right. And part of that is, and this is the point they make, is that one of the things that we do, well, you can say the West, but really globally, right? This sort of Western political system now is pretty much pervades the whole, the whole realm, right? But that we turn wealth into power through money and property. That's what our societies do, and that's what's different about a lot of these societies in North America that we were studying, not just in North America, right? I mean, they study, societies across the world, but wealth didn't necessarily equal power. So I might be more wealthy in my tribe or my settlement. Maybe I have more cattle or whatever it might be, but that doesn't translate to power. Because of that, I don't get to tell people what to do. And that's the big difference. That if I'm a member of that society, I can still ignore your commands. I can still not accede to your requests. And that's a huge difference, right? If somebody has wealth in one of our societies today, we can turn that very easily into power, as you say, through lobbying or other processes. But that's just not the case. Just not the case in these societies. I don't get more power if I become more wealthy.
Yeah, it's the whole book is also a kind of mirror for our current society, where we still are raised with those basic beliefs, I would call it, of the Enlightenment, about freedom, liberty, equality, and fraternity, caring for each other. And you can put a big question mark behind those three basic principles. And that's done here in the historical context. But you can also put it in a contemporary context. And that's also the starting point of David Graeber, who wrote Bullshit Jobs and was one of the intellectuals behind Occupy Wall Street, etc. And they then also take the context of anthropology, prehistorian excavations, etc. And then they show, let's say, from that perspective as well, that this whole idea that our civilization has to develop in a certain way, because otherwise it would be anarchy. Let's say in the negative way, that it would be one big mess. Is at least something those two authors give a lot of examples that is not the case. So this second part, that we need hierarchy, perhaps even we don't like it, but there's no other solution than have a kind of virtual hierarchy. And if somebody doesn't obey the rules, you have to put them in jail. These are those narratives which are just questioned, and questioned in a very interesting way, because they give a lot of examples from the past where you have different solutions for the same problem, so to say, or for the same starting point, or for the same question: how do we organize our societies? How do we build our cities? How do we supply housing to everybody? How do we distribute wealth, etc.? This you can call this provoking, but it's just interesting to question our own beliefs, so to say.
Yes. Yes, and it's that second aspect that fascinated me, and all of the examples that the Göbekli Tepe is a society he talks about, who that was discovered by German archaeologists in southeast Turkey on the Haran Plain, and they had they were non-hierarchical. They didn't have kings. They were hunter-gatherers, or maybe a little bit of farming, but they weren't farmers as we would think of farming societies. And yet they created monumental architecture. Yeah. So we have this idea, well, it's almost like with no hierarchy, with no kings, we get no cathedrals, right? We're not going to get big cities. We're not going to get that bounty that a hierarchical civilization offers us, and the examples, and there are many in the book, tell us that is not true. We can scale, we can create man-made wonders without the need for kings and hierarchy, and that's what's fascinating. It's particularly fascinating to me because we see examples of this in the modern workplace today with these companies, a bit like Viisi, that obviously that you're a co-founder of, but other companies where scale has been achieved without formal hierarchy, and we can do it, and it obviously has been done historically,
or at least
at the level of society.
I mean, at least let's say they describe those mechanisms of let's say rotation or decentralized decision making, etc., which actually we also know pretty well. Huh? So there are enough societies where, let's say, I was take the European Union, or just let's say our European let's say, countries where you have on a city level, you have certain powers and they are divided from, let's say, then the province and from national politics. And people decide for themselves if they want to renovate the swimming pool of the city or want to put their money somewhere else, etc. And let's say, depending on the country, it's a clearer split. In Switzerland, for instance, you have 3 different tax bills. One goes to the city, one goes to the province, one goes to the state, and you know exactly how much money you pay for what entity. So this idea of decentralized decision making, that it makes sense, is also something we also have in our societies. But what is so striking is that, let's say, if you just see this kind of prehistorical excavations, and that's also, I find it a strong point. I mean, I haven't studied anthropology, but they have a lot of examples. So it's not that they have found one example. No, they show that all over the world. It's in Mexico or Turkey or Mesopotamia or whatsoever, or Ukraine. They find those examples everywhere. So and what's the strong point about this? It says, okay, this is not an exception. People on different places and different times found the same outcome. They built on a more equal way. So they just say, just very practical. You do those excavations and you're searching for a palace, but you don't find one. You only find, let's say, houses or apartments around a kind of courtyard. They all have more or less the same size. And then you have a city of, I don't know, 100,000, or I don't know if it's even much bigger. I think if you talk about Mexico, etc., and they say it's in comparison to Athens. Athens is smaller than a village in comparison to those excavations in Mexico. And they say an enormous amount of people, and then they find a kind of structure, and then they find that there are kind of rotation structures, or how people helping their neighbors, etc. So in a very decentralized way. And then the question is, how is this possible? That such civilized and intelligent structures of creating, let's say, big cities with an enormous complexity. How did this work? I found it fascinating to read this.
Yeah. Yes, and particularly when we talk about these examples of the cities where everybody had roughly the same house. Well, this wasn't done through state communism, right? This wasn't done through a central command and control economy. As you say, they're speculating to some extent exactly how those government structures work. But as you say, the speculation is that it was local decision making. It was neighbor to neighbor. It was something that was.
I had to think about also political theory, John Rawls' theory of justice, where, and that's what I also learned at university, that somebody says, okay, if you just imagine you're born somewhere and you don't know if you're born from a wealthy family or exactly the opposite, how would you organize a society? And the conclusion is you would like to have a quite egalitarian society, because you don't know in which situation you would be in. And this is more or less the practical prehistorical anthropology, let's say, view of this. That you say, okay, you have a huge city, you have 100,000 or 500,000 people. If I don't know, how would we organize this? And then we would probably come to the same conclusion. Let's divide in a way that everybody has a kind of certain space. And shall we build a kind of structure where if you are in need, you have a neighbor who will help you, because I will do the opposite as well. Huh? That's a golden rule, so to say. So, and that's what I find fascinating.
Yeah, exactly. And that Rawlsian idea that we want to sort of optimize society to give each new incoming member of it the best possible chance, I think gets the way that it then gets taken up is that, then we need a centralized state, to forcibly share the wealth so that everybody gets the best shot when they enter this society. But that's not the only way of thinking about how we might achieve that. And I think that's what this book throws up is, and maybe other ways to think about that. The other thing I liked about this, and I didn't study history, but I still had this conception of history of it being linear. that we went from these primitive hunter-gatherers, and then who then learned how to farm, and it was through farming and this ability to store a surplus that meant that they could then feed people who didn't have to work the land. So then we would get a priest class and an aristocracy, and those thinkers could then allow us to progress in other ways, and that would then enable us to create more sophisticated architecture, and then ultimately that feudal system that was one of the outgrowths of an agricultural society, then gave us urban systems, and then ultimately industrial systems, right, when we took that production to another level. And that's been the hour of time, and that's been our progress.
Yeah.
And this blows that apart. It's like you don't have to go through all those stages to end up at monumental architecture, right? Hunter gatherer societies can create monumental architecture, for example. And so I think that, and it's this very Western view, I suppose that's the way to think about it, is that we must be the pinnacle of progress.
Yeah.
And
it's something which, let's say, as a kind of a narrative. So linear thinking, the future will be better than the past. That's the way we are, let's say, educated. There are more and more topics where we can question this narrative. I mean, you can talk about biodiversity or climate, or let's say mental health, or even purchasing power. So how much money do you need, just to take the example of let's say the company I'm building with my colleagues. If you talk about mortgages, how much income, or what's the factor of the amount of incomes I need to earn to be able to buy a decent house for my family, as an example. Has this become better since the 50s or 60s or 70s? Or has this gone worse? So there are a lot of those narratives. Doesn't matter what you take, or let's say the amount of hours you work. You can take Charles Dickens, etc. But if you just see, let's say, your parents, most of the time, let's say there was the father who had a salary and he was able to earn enough to serve his family. He could go to college, etc. Talking about, let's say, the 70s or 80s. And now you have to work with two people to be able to earn enough money to reach the same goals. Now, perhaps we gone more on holiday, etc. But so there's also a question about purchasing power since the 80s. Did it go up for most of the people, or did it go down? So you have an enormous amount of different subjects where I think we are in a kind of phase or situation now where it's not very difficult to question, as we all experience this ourselves in our daily lives.
Yeah, and I hear that argument a lot. Like, let's go back to let's say the 50s, where one income could sustain a middle class family. But that's limited in thinking, right? Go back to medieval times, and there's arguments I've heard
that's correct.
That it, like, one man, a skilled craftsman, could work, I think, for 45 days and provide for his family for the whole year. And people would work far, far less, right? I think I had quoted, it's about 147 days in a year that people would work on average. And a lot of the architecture that got built in those times was voluntary. So a lot of those cathedrals were built with voluntary labor, because people could earn enough to feed their families in a relatively short amount of time. So this even the idea of one person providing an income on a 5-day a week might look like an extraordinary burdensome life to somebody further back.
But what I find interesting is just to question all those all those, let's say, kind of topics which are just thought as if they have a kind of eternal. They are thought like they are eternal beliefs, so to say. So if you take an example, a very simple one. If you have much more money, then you are happier, and then you compare. Or let's say if somebody wins the lottery, then you must be much happier than you were before. Now, we all know these examples. It's not the case. If you ask them half a year later, they're even less happier, which I find always striking, an excellent example. If somebody has a severe accident, you think, okay, it's not worthwhile living anymore. No, you ask somebody in a wheelchair, half a year later, same level again. So that's very interesting that it all goes back to a kind of average level, no matter where you come from. But also life expectancy goes down again in the UK and the US, as an example. It doesn't go. It's not one linear way up all the time, and it's not a kind of. I mean, if you think about correlations, it's always this kind of moral superiority that we're such a great species. We're building better and better societies all the time. But I think we live in times where we can question on a lot of dimensions. We can question this. Are we happier than our parents? Are we wealthier than our parents? Do we live in a more, let's say, less risky environment? Do we live in a healthier society? Do we feel more cared about, etc.? I mean, just to question all those questions is, let's say, from an intellectual point of view, I find this refreshing, and also in a way very confronting.
Yeah. Yes, and we're seeing that. I mean, we're seeing now these this movement of conscious communities, and I know that this is happening a lot in Mexico and parts of Central America, where people are getting together in groups and buying large sections of land and going back to live lifestyles very similar. It seems to me as that described by Candia Ronk and the Wendat. It's people are saying, well, no, that where we're at right now isn't the pinnacle of a possible existence. Yes, it's and interesting, and you could almost argue, right, that there is a parallel movement which you and I are perhaps part of in the workplace of saying, yeah, let's go back to a style of organization, that, yeah, is not bureaucratic, is not sophisticated in the way that we might think about organizations today, and that it's much, it's actually much more efficient and a much happier place to be if we let go of a lot of what we consider to be necessities of running a corporation or a business. Absolutely.
I mean, the last sentence of the book is, "We are surrounded by myths," and I think that's just to take it much broader. My conclusion is always I should question much more and much stronger the stuff I learned, or the stuff I read, or the stuff I see, or stuff I listen to. Is this really true, or as I always use as an example, could the opposite also be true? Is there also a kind of alternative idea to what I think, just for the sake of discussion or intellectual curiosity? And it's not about let's say what we see nowadays. Doesn't matter what topic. That it's much more you surround yourself by people who have the same opinion. And if somebody doesn't have the same opinion about COVID, or doesn't matter what topic, you don't talk to each other anymore. Now, the old idea of let's say educating yourself is surround yourself with people who have an opposite opinion. To for the sake of the discussion, say, okay, let's say what can teach somebody else me with another opinion. It's to sharpen your mind, so to say. that's what I find interesting, and that's what if I just read about those Jesuits and with their moral superiority, they discussed with those inhabitants on a very respectful way, and I think
Yeah.
this was much more respectful than the way we discuss nowadays. And it doesn't matter if it's populism or Trump or so you can take or just take the actual situation in the UK. There's always enough political discussion going on, but let's just invite ourselves to discuss the opposite.
Well, yeah, and we don't create space. I think it's because we don't develop a maturity, or a society doesn't allow us to develop a maturity in the ability to debate and reason and dialogue with each other. We have these rushed lives, where we're very busy. We don't have time and space to develop in that way, and that's again what Candia Ronk talks about, and what gets observed in these societies, that a lot more of a much bigger proportion of the day is spent in debate and dialogue. And it echoes something that I remember from a conversation with a company called Eight Pines in Argentina, who are a software company, and they don't have any formal hierarchy. And I asked them, how do you deal with leadership development? And they said, well, we don't really have a concept of a leader here. They're very flat hierarchy. We have citizens, and we think about citizen development within the company. And the way that we develop our citizens is that we're constantly having open debate and dialogue about proposals to move the company forward. And people learn and cut their teeth in debate and dialogue by coming into those fora, proposing their solutions to problems or investments that they think the company should be making. And they learn to make their case and debate with others through that process. So that is our leadership development. And I thought that was fascinating, and it has echoes of what we're talking about here. That the very society creates individuals who become wise and reasoned through the processes that they engage in on a day-to-day basis.
But what I find interesting is, let's say, those people that just discussed those topics. I mean, they were also leaders, huh?
Yeah.
But they were leaders with let's say in their societies. There were those mechanisms that you didn't have to obey if you wouldn't agree to the rule. And I think this idea of, let's say, kind of moral leadership, somebody who does the right thing because otherwise people don't obey, this is what I find extremely powerful. Extremely powerful, because it doesn't mean that there shouldn't be a hierarchy. If you call a hierarchy kind of way stuff is structured, but there are checks and balances in the system. And this is what we also know from our Republican way of organizing states. You can't stay president for more than, let's say, 2 periods in the US as an example. So you see these whole ideas of, and that's also described in the book, there are those even kind of scientific or mathematical principles of rotation, of let's say helping each other, or just if a certain neighbor needs help, then the next one should help, and if this one is not able to help, then the next one. So there are all those kind of rotation principles. They're also governing themselves. So in those cities, one finds also kind of common spaces where people probably have discussed the way they build those cities. So as long as, let's say, people perhaps vote or choose somebody from this group, that's totally okay. But there's a kind of moral leadership which also speaks from those conversations with the Jesuits, which were written down, and that's what I found so powerful. So you can have power, and then if somebody doesn't obey the rule, then you put somebody in prison. But how powerful is leadership if somebody does not have to obey your rule? That's what I find so fascinating.
Yeah. Well, and it behoves then somebody seeking power and influence, or at least influence, to develop their debating skills. It makes sense that people that would then create a society where people have much stronger ability to persuade others. And in fact, Lahontan, who met Candia Ronk in Canada, he said he'd never met anybody in his life who was as skilled an orator, who was as charismatic, who was as witty, who was as wise as this one individual.
That's a really good remark, because that's what I find so fascinating, that those Jesuits, although they had difficulties to admit that those native leaders were so skilled and so powerful, also from a moral point of view, they still have this kind of self-reflection, and they write then that those people are much more skilled in their conversational skills, but they also explain why. Because if you only have, let's say, the power of explaining your decisions, you have to be very skilled, because otherwise people wouldn't obey the rules.
Yeah.
And that's something totally different. So it doesn't matter what your opinion is. If you don't like it, I will lock you away. And that's more or less Foucault again, huh? That this whole idea of using your power or abusing your power to lock away those people you don't like, or the opinion of those people you don't like. That's what actually, which is a very interesting philosophical debate. Where are also, let's say, frontiers or borders of things which are allowed or not. I mean, if you just take the whole discussion about climate actions at the moment, where people put soup on a painting, but there is glass in front of it, and then those people should be punished because you're not allowed to put soup in a museum on a painting, although it's behind glass. That's where an enormous discussion is going on, and perhaps even less discussion about people who are ruining, let's say, our globe, no matter in what dimension. So this whole idea, who's punishing whom for what, is a very fundamental discussion or question, which always has been there, and which is discussed in those discussions between the Jesuits and those leaders of these native groups in North America.
Yeah, and we now seem to be in an age where we don't seem to have the spaces right now where we can have these kind of debates, right? Yeah, we sort of we take our arguments to the streets, or we do protests, and of course there's cancel culture. You don't like someone who's saying, "Oh, let's destroy their livelihood." And yeah, we seem to right now be in a period, right, where we're losing or have lost a large part of our capability in that area to have dialogue.
It would also be a nice bridge, just to end with a positive note. There's a lot of discussion going on about citizen assemblies, and where people in a kind of random way, not totally random, but they're chosen to further develop our, let's say, parliaments or democracies, and then you get back this kind of let's say participation of a society as a whole, and not of a very small elite group which sits in parliament to change or further develop our, let's say, our own political systems. So, but that's perhaps a topic for
but it's important. It's absolutely important to point to that. That's what it stimulated me to do, is to think about, okay, well, what can we envisage? Right, we can't start living like necessarily immediately like these people in this society. But what can we do? And I love the sort of pop that the authors have at Yuval Noah Harari. They said in their conclusion, actually, Harari writes, "There is no way out of the imagined order. When we break down our prison walls and run towards freedom," this is Harari saying this, "we are in fact running into the more spacious exercise yard of a bigger prison. And that kind of nihilistic view that we're kind of destined to this life of serfdom and servitude. And when you hear, Yuval Harari talk, he does seem to have this sort of somewhat dystopian view for the majority of society, right? And we can absolutely reject that. We can absolutely be imaginative and imagine new ways of organizing ourselves. And we are doing it in the business realm. There's no reason we can't extend that to society. Absolutely. Good. All right. Well,
Richard,
thanks once again, Tom. This was great. Thanks for suggesting the book. I really enjoyed it. This really stimulated my thinking.
Everybody should
read
to
the next one. Yes. So let's remind people again, the dawn of everything.
So to say, for the better.
Yeah, the dawn of everything. A new history.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I hope you enjoyed this episode of You Should Read This with me, Richard Atherton, and my fantastic co-host, Tom van der Lubbe. If any of the material in this show resonated with you, if you're thinking, perhaps, how could I take these ideas and apply them in my own leadership or take them forward into my own organization, then I would love to have a conversation with you about that. If that feels like that could be a valuable use of your time, then please do click on the Calendly link in the description for this episode. And that will allow you to book a slot directly into my calendar. And I hope to speak to you soon.